Bill. Feel very awkward giving a lecture over PowerPoint, but I think this is going to save us so much time. So we're starting today with the civil rights movement. I'm just going to give you an overview from the 1950s to the 1960s. When you come to class, you're going to break down some DBQs and write a body paragraph on this, so your background knowledge is crucial. So make sure you're pausing and you're taking good Cornell notes or whatever type of notes you're taking as we go through this slide. Okay, so before we get into the civil rights movement, we need to refresh what are some of the reasons it started. So civil wars from 1861 to 1865, you just did that review, or you should have just done that review. And we also know that after that, Reconstruction happened, and there was the 13th Amendment to end slavery, the 14th Amendment for equal protection, and the 15th Amendment to give voting rights to all men of any color. But we also know that in the South, Reconstruction didn't go very well, and Jim Crow laws were implemented. This often made it difficult for blacks to vote. It had separate facilities for blacks and whites. Interracial marriage was illegal, and schools were segregated. The Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson ruled that this is constitutional as long as facilities are equal. So you are allowed to have separate facilities or separate things as long as they are equal. As I'm sure you can guess, nothing was equal. The civil rights also came after World War II. So World War II, there was a national movement to join the military or join factories. Women and African Americans were invited in part of this movement. However, a lot of African Americans were still discouraged from joining the military or factory jobs. A lot of activists threatened to march on Washington. So FDR ordered an executive order called 8802, which basically stated that national defense jobs are open to anybody, regardless of race, color, or national origin. As a result, there were a lot of African Americans that joined the military and therefore had quite a bit of power and increasing confidence based on. Okay, so we're jumping ahead. There's still segregation. One of the biggest segregation Supreme Court cases is Brown versus the Board of Education. Essentially, the story is in Kansas, schools were segregated, and for families, Brown went to court because it was inconvenient for them to have to go to a different neighborhood to go to a black school, and there were unequal facilities. They argued that the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Amendment, would grant them equal protection, and therefore that means you cannot segregate schools. And that is unconstitutional. The Supreme Court ruled in their favor, basically arguing that Plessy versus Ferguson is overturned. Any public facilities cannot have segregation. That being said, private facilities such as businesses are allowed to segregate. The Supreme Court did not rule that out. After the segregation, after the Supreme Court ruling that public schools cannot segregate, there were some places, particularly in Little Rock, Arkansas, that were trying to change the script and desegregate their high schools. One high school in Little Rock, Central High School, asked for volunteers to attend their primarily white school. So there were 9 volunteers. The day that they showed up, unfortunately, they could not go to school. They were met by the Arkansas National Guard, who prevented them from entering the school, as well as a mob of people that were screaming at them, spitting at them, throwing things at them as they walked in. So they didn't go for their own safety. Eventually, President Eisenhower ordered troops to Little Rock, and those troops escorted those 9 students to their classes for a while. However, as I'm sure you can imagine, they still faced quite a bit of discrimination. But it was a landmark turn and movement to desegregate schools in the South. Furthermore, in the South, you all know Rosa Parks, I'm sure. The story is she was on a bus. A white man went on the bus. There weren't seats for him in the white spot, so the bus driver asked Rosa and others to move, and she refused. She was arrested. As a result of her arrest, she became a leader in the boycott of Montgomery buses in Alabama. So any African Americans in Alabama refused to ride that bus until things changed. This boycott went on for 381 days until the Supreme Court declared that segregation of public buses and transportation is unconstitutional. Other things that are happening in the South. In 1960, in Greensboro, North Carolina, 4 college students refused to leave their lunch counter until they were served. So they didn't want to be served, or they weren't allowed to be served at the lunch counter. The counter refused to serve them. Hundreds of others joined, including college students from all over the United States, both white and black. And they all did sit-ins and refused to leave this lunch counter until the 4 were served. After they were served, it launched the Student Nonviolent Committee, which will come up again, but it's essentially college students taking on nonviolent protests. Martin Luther King is also a founder of the nonviolent protests of segregation. He was a Baptist minister from the South, and he is a central figure in the movement to desegregate the South. In 1963, he did the March on Washington, where they were protesting the lack of legislation to prevent desegregation in the South. 200,000 people marched, and it was a nonviolent protest. This is when he gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. This led to civil rights legislation. The civil rights legislation was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson in March 1964. The legislation ruled that there has to be equal employment, so you cannot discriminate based on color. There's an end to segregation in both public and private facilities, so restaurants can no longer segregate. And federal funds cannot be used for discriminatory programs like public education. So schools, even if they didn't implement the Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus Board of Education, they now had to because public funding goes to public education, so they must desegregate. This is arguably the biggest civil rights legislation passed then and since then to really change discrimination. Voting was still a problem, though, and the civil rights legislation didn't help with that. So in 1965, led by Martin Luther King Jr., 600 people marched in Selma, Alabama, to protest the killing of a black activist by the police and to protest the lack of voting legislation. The protest started nonviolent, but protesters were stopped and beaten by police as they were trying to walk over the bridge into Selma. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed again by Lyndon B. Johnson. This act banned literacy tests to vote. It set in place federal examination of voting. So, for example, they would send non-biased people to polls to make sure that voting was fair and equal. And it also gave people a chance to contest or argue against poll taxes. Poll taxes were eventually ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So this is what's happening in the South. At the same time, or a little bit later in the 60s, you have a movement happening in the North. So Jim Crow is out, but there's still inequality, police brutality, poverty, and racism, particularly in large cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York City, and industrial cities like Cleveland, Indianapolis. Martin Luther King Jr. himself moved to Chicago in order to fight the different type of discrimination that was occurring in the North. One big figure in the North is Malcolm X. He was a spokesman for the Nation of Islam, so he was Muslim. And he is famous for saying it is important for Blacks to cast the shackles of racism by any means necessary. A lot of people interpreted this as being that protesters are allowed to use violence if they need to in order to prevent racism. He's considered a controversial figure in contrast to Martin Luther King Jr. However, in my personal opinion, I don't think he's that controversial. So if you want to know more, look it up. We also have the Black Panther Party. This started in Oakland, California after Malcolm X's death and the police killing of a black teen. Early on, the party was meant for self-defense, to monitor police activities, especially in predominantly black communities. However, as they grew, they started to have political platforms on equal employment and equal housing. Unfortunately, the FBI put them on their anti-communist list organization and went out and basically destroyed the Black Panther movement. The last part of this is Black Power. So this is a phrase that became famous in 1966 by Stokely Carmichael. He was the leader of the Nonviolent Student Committee. Black Power is an argument or a statement to say that the Black community should assume control over their own community and their own communities to fight against discrimination and to challenge white supremacy, and violence may be necessary. The idea with this violence, though, isn't to fight against every white person, more just to fight against racist systems that continually oppress Blacks in America. This replaced Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous Freedom Now statement and therefore became somewhat controversial at this time. Okay, that is the end of my civil rights lecture. If you need to do more research outside of this to understand more, please do. This PowerPoint is for you to be able to do this well. You better believe there's going to be a quiz on this next time I see you. Okay.